March 28th, 1945. Iwo Jima. Deep inside a nameless tunnel carved into the island's volcanic flesh, an almost absolute darkness reigns, as thick and heavy as sodden earth. The air, saturated with the smell of cordite, stale blood, and primal fear, feels solid, so thick you could cut it with a knife. In this darkness, in this antechamber to hell, sits a man who, just a month ago, believed that hell was a metaphor. Now he knew that hell was a place, a specific, tangible place, and it had an address. Lieutenant Michael O'Connell, a chaplain in the United States Marine Corps, clutches the cold alien metal of an M1 Garand rifle. His fingers, accustomed to turning the thin pages of a Bible, now grip the worn wood of the stock until his knuckles ache. A silver crucifix hangs on his chest, over his filthy fatigue soaked with sweat and another man's blood. But he no longer feels its chill. He feels nothing but a dull, all-consuming ringing in his ears and the frantic, ragged rhythm of his own heart. His eyes, once clear and full of compassion, have become two dark voids reflecting only the tiny, trembling flame of a Zippo in the hands of a wounded corporal, Doc Peterson, lying a few feet away. In this light, the chaplain's face is a mask from a Greek tragedy, frozen horror mixed with icy resolve. He is no longer praying. The words had withered on his lips, turned to ash, and grated against his teeth back up there, on the black sand under a leaden sky. Down here, in the bowels of Mount Suribachi, there was no room for God's words. There was only one rule: kill or be killed. And he, a servant of him who commanded, "Thou shalt not kill," had made his choice. He stares into the tunnel's depths, where the darkness thickens to absolute black, and waits. He waits for the scream. He waits for the tramp of boots. He waits for the final, desperate charge of those who defend this island with a fanaticism he could neither comprehend nor forgive. He is no longer a preacher. He is no longer a shepherd. He is a soldier, a sentry at the gates of the hell he himself helped create. And in that moment, he did not yet know that his most terrible battle awaited him not here, in this foul burrow, but in the silence of the post-war world, where he would have to forever look into the eyes of the ghosts of those he killed, and the ghost of the man he once was. But to understand how a man of God became a sentry of hell, how a man of faith became a man of the rifle, we must go back 37 days, to the day his world, built on unshakable commandments, collapsed forever, swallowed by the black volcanic sand of a cursed island. February 17th, 1945. Somewhere in the Pacific, aboard the transport ship USS Dyer, the air was thick with a strange, almost tangible mixture of smells. The salt spray mixed with the heavy fumes of diesel fuel, the hot metal of the engine room, and that unique aroma of hundreds of young, sweaty male bodies crammed into a steel box in the middle of an endless blue. For Lieutenant Michael O'Connell, a 27-year-old chaplain, it was the smell of anticipation. He stood on deck, leaning against the rail, and stared at the horizon where the gray sky merged with the gray water. The ocean was calm, its steady breathing a lullaby. But this tranquility was deceptive, like the silence before a storm. Michael was tall and lean, with a shock of dark hair the wind constantly tousled, and eyes the color of Irish moss. Eyes that still held a belief in a world that was ordered and just. He had graduated with honors from Harvard Divinity School. His sermons in a small Boston church drew full houses. His words comforted widows and gave hope to the desperate. He believed in the power of the word. He believed that prayer could move mountains, and that compassion could heal any wound. For him, the war was an abstract evil, a tragic anomaly that needed to be corrected by returning lost souls to the light. And he saw his mission precisely in this: to carry light into the darkness, to be an anchor of faith for those on the verge of drowning in an ocean of cruelty. Now, Staring into the featureless distance, he mentally rehearsed his Sunday sermon. He wanted to talk about David and Goliath, about how a small man's faith can crush a giant armored tyrant. It seemed to him a perfect metaphor for the Marines preparing to storm the impregnable fortress called Iwo Jima. Life bustled around him. Marines, young men, most of them barely 19, tried to kill time. One cleaned his rifle with the focus of a surgeon, another played cards, laughing loudly and cracking salty jokes, while another just sat, staring into space, his face an impenetrable mask. Michael knew many of them by name. He spent hours with them, listening to stories about girls left back home, about plans for post-war life, about the fears they hid behind a show of bravado. He saw them not as soldiers, but as a flock. Lost lambs he was to guide through the valley of the shadow of death. Gunnery Sergeant Thomas Stonewall Sullivan, the platoon leader Michael was assigned to, approached him. Sullivan was the chaplain's complete opposite. Short, stocky, with a face carved from granite and hands like two pieces of old leather. He had been through Guadalcanal and Tarawa and saw the world without illusions. He didn't believe in God, the devil, or miracles. He believed in three things: his rifle, his men, and the fact that tomorrow might not come. Getting ready to feed the boys their spiritual chow, Padre? His voice was low and gravelly. There was no mockery in it, more a weary statement of fact. Michael smiled. Trying to find the right words, Gunny. They need hope. Sullivan grunted and knocked his pipe against the ship's side. Hope's a dangerous thing, Padre. It makes a man raise his head from a foxhole when he ought to be hugging the dirt. They don't need hope. They need full magazines and a clear head. Nearby, sitting on an ammo crate, was Private First Class Stanley Kowalski, a skinny kid from Chicago with a cynical smirk that never seemed to leave his face. He was the voice of despair in their small world. Yeah, Padre, he chimed in, not looking up from sharpening his combat knife. Why don't you tell us how? After we get smeared all over the beach, we'll go straight to the pearly gates. That's more convincing than some fairy tale about a slingshot and a giant. A few Marines chuckled nervously. Michael felt a wave of irritation rise within him, but quickly suppressed it. Anger was not his weapon. I believe the soul is immortal, Private, he answered softly. And my job is to look after your souls. Sergeant Sullivan will look after your bodies. Sullivan shot Kowalski a heavy look, and the private fell silent. That evening, in his tiny space that served as both office and cell, Michael wrote a letter to his sister. He described the ocean, the stars, the faces of the boys, full of courage. He wrote that he was proud to be there, that he felt his purpose more keenly than ever. He didn't write about the deep underlying fear that sent a chill down his spine every time the officers at a briefing uttered that strange, hissing word, Iwo Jima. He didn't write about how at night he dreamt not of angels, but of dark, faceless waves crashing on a black shore. He sealed the envelope, knowing he would only send it after the operation. That night, he still believed he would have an after. He lay on his narrow bunk, listening to the thrum of the ship's engines, which sounded like the beating of a great steel heart carrying them all toward their fate. He had no idea that in 48 hours that heart would stop, and he would hear entirely different sounds. Sounds that would forever burn every prayer from his soul. February 19th, 1945. 09:02 hours. Beach Red 1. The cataclysm had no single sound, smell, or color. It was absolute, all-consuming chaos. The moment the ramp of the Higgins boat slammed down with a deafening screech, Michael O'Connell's world ceased to exist. Everything that came before, the calm ocean, the sermons, the faces of his comrades, collapsed into a single point and vanished, replaced by primal terror. The first thing he felt was not fear, but the physical impact of a shockwave. It wasn't just a loud noise. It was a wall of thunder composed of thousands of separate but fused hellish melodies. The deafening roar of the naval guns behind him, the piercing whistle of shells overhead, the dry, cracking bark of machine guns, the deep, gut-wrenching explosions of mines and mortar rounds ahead. The air became dense with this sound. It vibrated, pressed on his eardrums, penetrated his bones. Then came the smell. The acrid, choking smell of burnt powder, mixed with the ozone freshness of a lightning strike, and the nauseatingly sweet, metallic scent of fresh blood. The smell instantly clogged his nostrils, filled his lungs, and it felt as if he were breathing death itself. And finally, he saw it. He saw hell. The black volcanic sand, which had looked merely unusual in photographs, was in reality like the ash of a burned world. It was loose, viscous, and the legs of the Marines running from the boat sank into it up to their ankles, making them slow, clumsy targets. And everywhere, people were falling into that black ash. They didn't fall theatrically, like in the movies. They just broke. There was a young man, with whom Michael had shared a chocolate bar that morning, who took a few steps, and then his head simply disappeared in a red mist. There was another, shouting something, who stumbled, and his body was torn to pieces by an invisible blast. The water at the shore wasn't blue, but a muddy red, and in it, like gruesome flowers, bobbed the bodies of those who hadn't managed to take a single step on land. A rough shove in the back jolted Michael from his stupor. "Move it, Padre, goddammit! This ain't Sunday school!" Sergeant Sullivan roared, his face a mask of fury and supreme concentration. O'Connell, stumbling, fell out of the boat into the waist-deep water. The cold shock momentarily brought him to his senses. He ran, knees high, toward the shore, his brain refusing to process what his eyes were seeing. This wasn't a battle. It was a slaughter. He had been trained to comfort the dying, to give last rites, to hold a hand, to whisper words of hope. But how could he do that when dozens of men were dying within a 100-yard radius every second? Who should he run to? Whose hand should he hold? He saw a corpsman trying to bandage a wounded man, and in the next instant, a pillar of black smoke and sand engulfed them both. Michael dropped to the ground, covering his head with his hands. He began to pray. "Our Father, who art in heaven," he muttered. But his words were lost in the cacophony of war. He could feel the ground tremble beneath him from nearby explosions. He could feel hot shrapnel whistling inches from his head. And he realized a terrible thing. His prayer was useless. It was a quiet, pathetic squeak in the face of this roaring, insatiable monster. God was silent. Or maybe he just wasn't here. On this damned black beach. He was not here. It was Sullivan again who pulled him from this paralyzing terror. He grabbed the chaplain by the collar and dragged him toward a small shell crater that offered some semblance of cover. "You can pray later, Padre, if there's anyone left to pray for. Right now, just try not to get yourself killed," he screamed directly into his ear. In the crater, a few survivors from their platoon were already huddled, including Kowalski, who was frantically reloading his rifle, his face as white as a sheet, his cynical smirk gone without a trace. Michael lay at the bottom of the crater, his body racked with violent tremors. He looked at his hands. They were clean. Too clean for this place. His weapon, a Bible in a waterproof pouch on his belt, seemed a ridiculous, out-of-place artifact from another world. He was a stranger here. Useless. He looked at Sullivan's face and for the first time saw something more than just weariness and cynicism in his eyes. He saw the cold, primal fury of a man protecting his tribe. And in that moment, Michael O'Connell understood. If he wanted to survive, if he wanted to fulfill his duty in any meaningful way, he would have to become more than just a shepherd. He would have to become part of this pack, part of this hell. The first few days on Iwo Jima blurred for Michael into a single, endless nightmare woven from thunder, screams, the stench of death, and the all-pervading black sand that got into everything. His clothes, his food, his lungs, his soul. His platoon, or what was left of it, was attached to an assault team assigned the dirtiest, most terrifying job in this war, clearing out Japanese bunkers and tunnels. The whole island, they said, was like Swiss cheese beneath the surface, riddled with miles of underground passages, firing positions, and barracks. The Marines had a simple name for this work: blowtorch and corkscrew. First, the engineers would go in, blasting the entrances to stun the defenders. Then came the flamethrower operators. Michael had never seen a flamethrower in action before, and what he witnessed burned an unhealing scar onto his retinas. The jet of burning napalm erupting from the nozzle with a guttural roar was like the devil's fiery finger. It poured into embrasures and ventilation shafts, and seconds later screams would rise from beneath the earth. Screams so filled with agony that Michael's blood ran cold. They were inhuman screams, full of a pain he thought no living creature made in God's image should ever have to endure. After the flamethrowers, the assault teams moved in with rifles and grenades, and Michael followed them. His official duty was to provide last spiritual rites to the wounded and dying Americans. But reality proved far uglier. He tried. He honestly tried to do his duty. He crawled the wounded Marines under heavy fire, held their hands, and recited prayers. But his voice was drowned out by the roar of battle. His words about eternal life and forgiveness sounded hollow and foolish when, lying next to him in the mud, was a 19-year-old kid with his guts spilling out. What could he say to him? That this was all part of God's plan? That his suffering had meaning? He looked into their fading eyes and saw not hope, but only pain, fear, and a single, mute question. Why? And he had no answer. He tried to organize a service. One evening, during a brief lull, he gathered a dozen survivors around him in a large shell crater. He took out his field Bible and opened it to Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. He never finished. A characteristic whistle sounded in the sky, and everyone instinctively ducked. A mortar round exploded 50 meters, about 165 feet away, showering them with clumps of earth and small hot fragments of shrapnel. No one was hurt, but the moment was lost. The service was over before it began. The men silently dispersed to their foxholes, their faces even grimmer than before. That evening, Kowalski approached him. His cynicism was now caked in a thick layer of grime and fatigue. "You know, Padre," he said quietly so the others couldn't hear, "maybe you should just stop. Your fairy tales don't work here. They just make things worse. It's like you're trying to cover all this with cheap pink paint, but it won't cover. It just bleeds right through." Michael said nothing, because deep down, he knew Kowalski was right. His faith, so strong and clear in the quiet halls of Harvard, was cracking at the seams here on Iwo Jima. It had proven to be a fragile hothouse structure, unable to withstand the hurricane of reality. He saw Japanese soldiers, even when mortally wounded, clutch a grenade and blow themselves up along with the American medics trying to help them. He saw a fanaticism that did not fit into his Christian worldview. This wasn't just a war of soldiers against soldiers. It was a war of ideologies, a war of worlds. And in this war, there was no room for compassion. Gradually, he began to change. He realized his hands could be more useful than his voice. He started helping Doc Peterson, the platoon corpsman. He brought bandages, held the canteen to a wounded man's lips, helped apply tourniquets. His prayers became shorter, quieter, more like a mumble. And then he stopped praying out loud altogether. Instead, he started carrying a few extra canteens of water and ammo pouches on his belt. When the assault team went on an attack, he went with them. And if someone ran out of ammunition, he would silently hand them a full magazine. Sergeant Sullivan watched this at first with suspicion, but then nodded in approval. "That's better, Pedre," he rasped one day. "Water and bullets save more souls here than all your psalms." Michael didn't know if that was true, but he felt that, at least this way, he wasn't useless. He was becoming part of the mechanism, a cog in this terrible machine of death. And every clip he handed over, every sip of water he gave to a soldier going out to kill, was a small step away from the man he used to be. He still wore the cross around his neck, but he increasingly caught himself thinking that it was no longer a symbol of faith, but just a piece of metal. A monument to a man buried beneath the black ash of Iwo Jima. A week passed, feeling like an eternity. Michael learned to live in a new, inverted world. He learned to sleep to the accompaniment of artillery barrages, to distinguish the whistle of an enemy mortar from a friendly one, to eat cold rations mixed with sand, and to ignore the omnipresent smell of decay. Most importantly, he found his place in this hell, his new, unexpected mission. His unexpected weapon was not the Bible or prayer, but what lay at their foundation, stripped of rituals and dogma, simple human empathy. He ceased to be a preacher and became a confessor. But they confessed to him not their sins but their fears. At night, in the shallow foxholes the Marines dug, soldiers would sidle up to him. They didn't ask for a blessing. They just talked. They talked in whispers, so others wouldn't hear. 19-year-old Corporal Miller, whom everyone called Kid, told Michael with tears in his eyes how terrified he was of dying without ever seeing his newborn daughter. Kowalski, the eternal cynic, admitted one night that he had stolen a pack of cigarettes from a buddy before the landing, and that buddy had been killed in the first few minutes of the battle. Now the pack burned a hole in his pocket like the mark of Cain. Sergeant Sullivan, the Rock, the man of Flint, sat down next to Michael once after a particularly brutal fight and stared at the stars in a long silence before saying gruffly, "I'm tired of burying them, Padre. I'm just so tired." Michael didn't offer ready-made answers from Scripture. He didn't say that God loved them and that everything would be all right. He just listened. He listened in a way a priest probably should, with his entire being, absorbing their pain, their fear, their guilt. He became a living vessel for the horror they could no longer carry inside themselves. He was their silent absolution. This new role gave him a fragile yet firm footing. He no longer felt useless. He was needed. Not as a messenger from heaven, but as a man willing to share their earthly hell with them. His first real victory, a victory not over the enemy but over his own despair, came on the 8th day of the battle. Their platoon was assaulting a well-fortified pillbox that was pouring lead over the entire sector. Several attacks had failed. Casualties were mounting. At one point during another attempt to get close to the embrasure, a flamethrower operator was badly wounded. He fell in an open area about 30 meters, around 100 feet, from their position, and screamed. His scream was thin, almost childlike, and it cut the ears worse than a machine gun burst. Everyone knew that any attempt to retrieve him was certain death. Sullivan gritted his teeth and ordered everyone to stay down. "There's nothing we can do. He's a dead man." And then Michael saw Kid Miller, the same boy who was afraid of dying without seeing his daughter, slowly start to get up. His eyes had a crazed, glassy sheen. "I'll get him," he whispered. Michael realized it wasn't bravery. It was a breakdown. Miller was ready for suicide just to stop hearing that scream. And then Michael did something they never taught him in any seminary. He grabbed Miller by the shoulder and yanked him down hard. "Stay down," he hissed with a harshness in his voice he didn't know he possessed. "You want to make your daughter an orphan over some false heroism?" Then he turned to the others. "Get me smoke grenades. All you've got!" The Marines exchanged bewildered glances, but Sullivan, after a moment's hesitation, nodded. A minute later, several smoke grenades flew toward the pillbox. Thick, white smoke began to cover the exposed ground. "Kowalski, Peterson, on me. The rest of you, covering fire on that embrasure, keep their heads down," Michael yelled, and without waiting for a reply, was the first one out of the trench. He ran, crouched low, through the white, billowing fog that was their only protection. Bullets snapped past, close. He could hear their angry, bee-like buzz, but there was no fear. There was only one clear, ringing thought. Make it in time. They reached the wounded man. Duck, Peterson quickly assessed the wound. His leg was practically torn off. The three of them hoisted the flamethrower operator and began dragging him back. He was heavy, moaning and losing consciousness. Every meter was an incredible effort. By the time they tumbled back into the trench, the smoke had almost cleared. They were alive. All four of them. The flamethrower operator died an hour later in Peterson's arms. But that was no longer the point. The point was, they hadn't abandoned him. They had challenged hopelessness and won. That night, no one spoke of heroism, but something had changed. The way Kowalski looked at Michael was no longer cynical. There was something in it akin to respect. And Kid Miller just walked up and silently shook the chaplain's hand. It was a small, local victory. They hadn't saved a life. They had saved something else. Something that allowed them to remain human in this inhuman world. But this act, this flicker of humanity in the heart of hell, did not go unnoticed. It had attracted the attention of those who dwelled in the darkness beneath their feet, those who knew neither compassion nor pity, those for whom any weakness in the enemy was merely an opportunity to strike. They didn't know it yet, but in saving one man, they had signed another's death warrant. Inspired by this small success, the men of Sergeant Sullivan's platoon seemed to find a second wind. The chaos of the first days began to give way to a grim, well-oiled routine. They had turned their section of the front into a small, ugly, but functioning state, built on the bones of fallen comrades and the ashes of incinerated enemies. Their capital was a network of trenches and craters. Their law was the sergeant's command. Their economy was the strict rationing of ammunition, water, and cigarettes. Michael O'Connell had become an integral part of this system, its unspoken minister of spiritual affairs. He no longer tried to preach sermons. His new church was a foxhole, his liturgy the silent listening of confessions and the timely offering of a canteen or a clip of ammunition. He established a daily routine that was absurd in its mundanity against the backdrop of the surrounding madness. Wake up at first light, which barely pierced the shroud of smoke and dust. Morning coffee. Hot water with a bitter powder dissolved in it that vaguely tasted of chicory. Then, work. Deepening trenches, replenishing ammo, cleaning weapons. It was monotonous, grueling work, but it was precisely this routine that kept the soldiers from going insane, that kept them from thinking too much about where they were and what their chances of survival were. Michael took on the heaviest moral duty. He collected the personal effects of the fallen. He carefully placed letters they never got to send, photos of wives and children, cheap amulets and talismans into a sack. For each fallen man, he made a separate bundle, tying his dog tag to it. He did this with the meticulousness of an archivist, and in these actions there was more sanctity and respect for the dead than in all the grandiloquent speeches he had once delivered from the pulpit. He became the keeper of their memory. He promised himself that if he survived, he would personally write a letter to every family. This promise became his new cross, a heavy one, but one that gave his existence meaning. Sergeant Sullivan, observing the chaplain's activities, became firm in his opinion. This strange padre was made of the right stuff. He didn't whine, he didn't panic, he didn't get underfoot with his books. He was useful. And Sullivan, without realizing it, began to trust him. He started consulting Michael about the men's morale, asking who was at their breaking point, who needed a rest. The chaplain became his eyes and ears, his barometer for the level of despair in the platoon. Their small world, their empire of mud and fear, seemed surprisingly stable. They had learned to survive here. They had adapted to hell. But it was this very stability, this illusion of control, that bred a new, even more terrifying threat, an internal one. The horror of war has a way of accumulating inside a person, like radiation. And when it reaches a critical mass, an explosion occurs. And this explosion occurred in the most unexpected of places, within the soul of Kid Miller, the very same young man Michael had saved from a suicidal charge. The rescue had not been without cost for him. He had watched the flamethrower operator die before his eyes. He had heard his final rattling breaths, and something inside him broke. He became quiet, withdrawn. He stopped talking about his daughter. His eyes took on that same glassy, vacant look Michael had seen just before that charge. He followed orders mechanically, like an automaton. One evening, as they sat in the trench eating their rations, Miller suddenly started to laugh. It was a quiet, choked laugh that sent shivers down everyone's spines. "You don't get it," he mumbled, staring into space. "It's all meaningless. We're just meat. They brought us here to die. And we will die. All of us. One by one." Kowalski, sitting next to him, tried to shake him out of it. "Shut up, Miller. Get a grip." But Miller wouldn't stop. His voice grew louder, rising to a hysterical scream. "And him," Miller pointed a finger at Michael. "He's the biggest liar of them all. He walks around here pretending he gives a damn. But really, he's just waiting for us all to croak so he can collect our trinkets and write phony letters to our widows. You're lying to us, Padre. Admit it. Your God isn't here." This was more terrifying than any banzai charge. It was a rebellion not against a commander but against hope itself, against the very meaning of their suffering. And this rebellion, like a virus, could infect everyone else. Michael saw the faces of the soldiers tense up, saw the same fear and doubt appear in their eyes. In the darkness of the trench, a mutiny of the spirit was beginning to brew. Miller's words hung in the heavy, powder-laced air like a death sentence. The silence that followed his hysterical scream was deafening. Everyone looked at Michael, waiting for his reaction. This was the moment of truth. One wrong word, one wrong move, and the fragile dam of discipline and morale they had so painstakingly built would collapse, and a wave of madness and despair would wash them all away. Michael felt dozens of pairs of eyes on him. In them, he read the silent question each man was asking himself but was afraid to say aloud. What if he's right? At that moment, Kowalski, the former cynic and now the chaplain's unofficial ally, stepped forward. "Shut your damn mouth, Miller," he snarled. "The Padre pulled your sorry ass out of the line of fire, and now you're slinging mud at him? Have you lost your mind?" But his words had no effect. Miller was no longer there. He was in his own private hell, and his eyes burned with an unhealthy, feverish fire. "He pulled me out?" Miller screamed, scrambling to his feet. "He just postponed the inevitable? We're all going to die here. You hear me? All of us. And our bones will mix with this damn black sand." Panic began to set in. Someone jumped up, someone started shouting, someone just covered his face with his hands. The system was cracking. Sergeant Sullivan, who had been watching the scene in silence, began to move forward, his hand already reaching for the grip of his pistol. He was ready to apply the Army's simplest and most effective method of problem-solving: force. But Michael stopped him with a motion of his hand. He knew that violence would only make things worse. This rebellion was spiritual, and it had to be fought with something other than a weapon. Michael slowly approached Miller, who was swaying on the edge of the trench, ready to leap out into the line of fire at any moment. The chaplain looked him straight in the eye. He didn't try to calm him. He didn't speak of God or duty. Instead, he used what would later be called a form of psychological surgical cruelty. "Yes, you're right," Michael said quietly, but loud enough for everyone to hear. "You're right, Miller. We're probably all going to die here. I'll die. The sergeant will die. Kowalski will die. Our chances of survival are almost zero. That's the truth." A dead silence fell over the trench once more. The soldiers stared at the chaplain with horror and bewilderment. He was saying what they were all thinking but were afraid to admit even to themselves. He was stripping them of their last illusion. "But you know what the difference is between us, Miller?" Michael continued, his voice becoming as hard as steel. "It's how we die. You can die right now, like a coward and a hysteric, and no one will remember you. Or you can die tomorrow, or the day after, like a Marine, protecting the guy standing next to you. You can die meaninglessly, or you can die giving your death some shred of meaning. The choice is yours." He paused, letting the words sink into everyone's mind. "And one more thing," he added, lowering his voice to a whisper. "Your daughter. Do you want her to know for the rest of her life that her father broke at the last minute, that he betrayed his comrades? Or do you want her to be proud of him, even if she never gets to see him?" Michael reached out and touched Miller's shoulder. "The choice is yours, son." Miller stared at him for a few long, endless seconds. His face twitched. In his eyes, madness warred with the last vestiges of reason, and then slowly, as if in a dream, he sank to the bottom of the trench and began to sob. Loudly, uncontrollably, like a child. The mutiny was over. Quelled not by force but by a cruel, merciless truth. Michael had defended his fragile world. He had proven that his weapon, the word, could still work, if used not as a bomb, but as a scalpel. The soldiers were silent, stunned. They saw in their chaplain not a soft-hearted comforter, but a man with an unbreakable steel core. That night, his authority became absolute. But while they were dealing with their inner demons, they failed to notice their real, external enemy preparing a trap for them. The observers in the Japanese bunkers, hidden behind narrow embrasures, had seen it all. The sortie for the wounded man, the panic in the trenches. They saw that this platoon, despite its losses, was still strong in spirit, and they knew it had to be destroyed. Not in open combat, but with cunning. They would lure them deep into their web and snap the trap shut. Fate was already preparing their final, most terrible trial in the depths of Mount Suribachi. Another 2 weeks of relentless fighting passed. The Marines slowly, meter by meter, clawed their way into the island's defenses. Mount Suribachi, the dormant volcano that dominated the southern part of Iwo Jima, was almost taken. The American flag, the very one that would become history, had been flying on its summit for several days. But beneath the summit, in its stone bowels, the war raged on. The Japanese garrison, following General Kuribayashi's orders, did not surrender. They retreated deeper into their miles-long network of tunnels, turning every foot of it into a death trap. Clearing these tunnels became Sullivan's platoon's main task. It was work for miners and gravediggers. The Marines entered the narrow, dark passages where one could barely stand upright, with helmet lamps on and weapons at the ready. The air was stale, smelling of damp earth, gunpowder, and something else. A sickly sweet, nauseating smell of death that seemed to have permanently soaked into the walls. Every turn could hide an ambush. Every side tunnel could be a false passage leading to a dead end where machine gunners were already waiting. It was a war fought by feel, a war of nerves, and Michael went with them. He couldn't stay outside. His place was there, next to his flock, in the thick of the darkness. He learned to move silently, to listen for the slightest rustle, to distinguish the echo of his own footsteps from others. He no longer carried his Bible. In these catacombs, it was useless. Instead, he carried an extra supply of plasma for Doc Peterson and bundles of grenades. On March 28th, they received orders to clear a large tunnel complex which, according to intelligence, was one of the last pockets of resistance in their sector. Something felt wrong from the start. The tunnel was eerily quiet. They had advanced several hundred meters without encountering a single enemy soldier or hearing a single shot. The silence was more unnerving than any firefight. "I don't like this," Sullivan whispered to Michael. "Too easy. Feels like a trap." They emerged into a large underground cavern. In the center stood a table with maps on it. In a corner, several crates of ammunition. It looked as if the Japanese had abandoned their command post in a great hurry. "Check all side passages," Sullivan ordered. And at that moment, the trap snapped shut. From all sides, from dozens of hidden embrasures in the walls, machine guns opened up. The beams from their helmet lamps darted about in panic. The air filled with screams, the roar of gunfire, and the ping of bullets ricocheting off the stone walls. Marines fell one after another. Michael saw Sergeant Sullivan, his rock, his anchor, take a few steps forward to organize a defense, and then collapse to the ground as if his legs had been cut from under him. A red stain on his chest spread rapidly. Kid Miller, the one who had conquered his despair, fell beside him, cut down by the same burst. In his wide, surprised eyes was a final question that would never be answered. Chaos, panic, death. The survivors, firing back, retreated into the same tunnel they had come from. But a new blow awaited them. From behind, near the entrance, a deafening explosion ripped through the air. The passage, their only escape route, was blocked by a cave-in. They were trapped in a stone tomb in the very heart of enemy territory. There were only 7 of them left: Michael, Doc Peterson, Kowalski, and 4 other Marines. Peterson was badly wounded in the leg. The others were in shock, demoralized. Their commander was dead. There was no way back. This was the end. They sat in the darkness, pressed against the wall of the narrow tunnel, listening to the triumphant shouts of the Japanese from the cavern beyond. They knew it wouldn't be long before they came to finish them off. And then Michael O'Connell knew it was his turn. Sullivan was dead. He, a lieutenant, a chaplain, was now the senior officer. He had to take command. He looked at the terrified, desperate faces of his comrades. He saw Kowalski fumbling to reload his rifle, his hands shaking so badly he couldn't get the clip into the receiver. He saw the young radio man just sitting there, head in his hands rocking back and forth. He saw the wounded Peterson gritting his teeth in pain, trying to tighten a belt around his wound. And he knew that prayers wouldn't help. Words of comfort would sound like a mockery. They needed something else. They needed a leader. And in that pitch-black tomb, Michael made the most terrible decision of his life. He crawled to the body of Sergeant Sullivan. He did not say a final prayer over him. Instead, he silently unbuckled his ammo pouches and took out the spare clips. And then he took his rifle, an M1 Garand. It was heavy and smelled of gunpowder and the blood of its former owner. Michael worked the action. In the echoing silence of the tunnel, the clang of steel rang out like a death knell. Everyone turned to look at him. In the trembling light of the Zippo that Peterson lit, they saw his face. It was calm, almost serene, but his eyes burned with a cold, unfamiliar fire. It was no longer the gaze of a shepherd. It was the gaze of a warrior. "Kowalski," he said in a firm, even voice, "give your rifle to Jones. You'll be the assistant gunner on the bar. Peterson, how much plasma you got? We need to hold out until morning. Maybe they'll realize we're missing and try to break through the cave-in." He spoke, and his words, clear, crisp, and full of icy confidence, began to push back the panic. He was organizing a defense. He was positioning his men. He was turning them, a handful of desperate souls, into a fighting unit. He had faced a choice, to pray or to shoot. And he chose to shoot. He lay down at the bend in the tunnel, resting the rifle on a pile of rocks. He stared into the impenetrable darkness from where the enemy would come. And he waited. He waited for the moment when, for the first time in his life, he would have to take a human life. And in that moment, awaiting the final battle, he felt something inside him die for good. The young, idealistic priest from Boston was left behind forever, up there, under the leaden sky of Iwo Jima. Down here, someone else was born. A soldier, a killer, a savior. They didn't come right away. They decided to play cat and mouse. From the depths of the tunnel, their voices carried, along with laughter. Sometimes they would bang on the walls, testing the Americans' nerves. Time stretched like molten lead. Each beat of his heart echoed in his ears like a funeral bell. Michael lay behind his makeshift parapet of rocks, his mind working with an unnatural, feverish clarity. He no longer thought about God, or the commandments, or his soul. All those concepts seemed infinitely distant, relics from another forgotten life. His world had shrunk to the size of this dark, foul-smelling tunnel. All that existed was him, his rifle, his comrades behind him, and the enemy ahead. It was a terrifying primal simplicity. He felt the fear recede, replaced by a cold, ringing rage. It wasn't hatred for specific people, for the Japanese. It was a rage against the situation itself, against the war, against this island that had forced him to become what he had become. It was the fury of a cornered animal, preparing to sell its life as dearly as possible. "Padre!" Peterson's hoarse whisper came from behind. Michael turned. Doc was leaning against the wall, his face gray from blood loss in the Zippo's light. "Padre, if I don't make it, tell my wife I..." Michael cut him off. "You're going to make it, Doc," he said harshly. "We're all going to make it. No last words. Focus on staying conscious. We need you." It was a lie. He didn't believe they would make it. But that lie was more necessary now than any truth. It was their last round of ammunition. And then they came. First, a wild, guttural cry echoed from around the bend. "Tenno heika banzai." And then, the tramp of dozens of feet. They weren't shooting. They were charging in a final suicidal bayonet attack, certain the Americans were broken and demoralized. They didn't know they were being met not by a terrified chaplain, but by a man with nothing left to lose. Time slowed down for Michael. He saw the first dark figure burst around the corner, a bayonet fixed to his rifle. He smoothly brought his sights to bear, held his breath just as he had been taught in basic training, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked hard and familiarly against his shoulder. The muzzle flash blinded him for a second, illuminating the Japanese soldier's face, twisted in pain and surprise. He fell. Without thinking, Michael chambered another round. The bar next to him roared to life, joined by the other rifles. The tunnel filled with fire, thunder, and screams. It was hell in miniature. Michael fired. He fired methodically, coolly, as if on a training range. He didn't think about the fact that he was aiming at living human beings. He saw only dark silhouettes, threats that needed to be eliminated. Every pull of the trigger was a full stop on his old life. With every shot, he was killing not only an enemy, but a piece of himself. The attack faltered. The Japanese retreated, leaving several bodies in the tunnel. Silence fell, even more terrifying than the roar of battle. In that silence, Michael heard his own breathing, ragged and hoarse. He looked at his hands, gripping the hot rifle. They were covered in gunpowder soot. He had killed. He, a priest, a servant of God, had taken a life. He waited for a wave of remorse, of horror, of self-loathing to wash over him. But there was nothing. Only emptiness. A cold, scorched emptiness. They held out until dawn. The Japanese launched 2 more attacks, but they were less ferocious. The defense of the handful of Americans, their furious resistance, had thrown them off. And in the morning they heard something they no longer dared hope for. From the other side of the cave-in came muffled thuds, then shouts in English. They had been found. They were being rescued. When the engineers cleared the rubble and the bright, blinding light of a new day flooded the tunnel, the rescuers saw a strange sight. On a pile of rocks, amidst spent casings and empty clips, sat a chaplain. His face was black with soot, his fatigue stained with blood, both his and others. He held a rifle in his hands and stared at a single point with unseeing eyes. He had survived. He had saved his men. He was decorated for bravery, a silver star for exceptional heroism in combat. To everyone, he was a hero, the fighting padre, a living legend of Iwo Jima. But for him, the medal was not a symbol of victory, but a brand, a symbol of his most terrible, spiritual defeat. He returned home a hero, met with parades and flowers. But he could no longer be who he once was. He could no longer stand at the altar and speak of forgiveness and love. How could he speak of forgiveness when the faces of those he killed in that dark tunnel were forever seared into his memory? How could he speak of love when a cold, scorched emptiness had taken root in his heart? He would forever remain a soldier from that black island. A soldier in a perpetual war with himself. Michael O'Connell returned to America in 1945. But in truth, A part of his soul remained forever on Iwo Jima, buried beneath the black volcanic sand. His rescue had become a new, more sophisticated prison. A prison of memory and fame. When he walked down the gangplank of the troop transport, he was greeted as a hero. Reporters, camera flashes, smiling faces, hands extended for a handshake. Newspaper headlines screamed, "The hero priest, the padre with a rifle, faith and courage on Iwo Jima." His story, embellished and polished by the war propaganda machine, became a symbol of the unyielding American spirit, where faith in God and love of country merged into a single victorious cry. He was invited to speak at schools, churches, factories. Everyone wanted to hear the story of how he, armed only with prayer and righteous anger, had stopped a horde of fanatics. And so he spoke. He said the right, carefully chosen words about duty, sacrifice, and the faith that helps overcome any trial. But every time he spoke those words, he felt the bitter taste of ash on his tongue. He was lying. He was lying to them all. Because in that tunnel, it wasn't faith that had saved him. It was hatred. It was the cold-blooded efficiency of a killer. And that truth was too ugly, too inconvenient for the shining myth of the hero. The very system that celebrated him also crucified him. During debriefings at headquarters, intelligence officers questioned him with cold curiosity about the details of the fight. They weren't interested in his feelings or his moral torment. They were interested in tactics, the number of enemy killed, the effectiveness of his defense. He felt less like a man and more like a lab rat that had been put through a cruel experiment. His feat was dissected, studied, and filed away in an archive under a classified stamp. His personal tragedy became nothing more than an interesting case study for military analysts. The hardest trial was returning to his home church in Boston. He had hoped that here, in the silence, among familiar faces and stained glass windows, he could find peace. But it never came. He put on his cassock, walked to the altar to deliver a sermon, and looked out at the congregation. He saw the faces of his parishioners, kind, calm, serene, and he realized that an abyss lay between them. They lived in a world where good and evil were clearly defined, where the commandments were unbreakable, and suffering was but a temporary trial. He had come from a world where good and evil were twisted into one grotesque knot, where murder was a virtue and prayer was a powerless mumble. He opened his mouth to begin his sermon, but not a sound came from his throat. He looked at the crucifix above the altar, at the tormented face of Christ, and for the first time in his life, he felt nothing. Not compassion, not reverence. Only a cold, detached curiosity. He left the church that same day, leaving a letter of resignation on the table. He could no longer be a shepherd. A man who has lost his own soul cannot save the souls of others. He tried to find the survivors from his platoon, but here too, he was met with disappointment. Their brotherhood, forged in the hell of Iwo Jima, was shattered by the peace. Doc Peterson, whose leg had been saved, drank himself to death, dying of cirrhosis 5 years after the war. Kowalski went back to Chicago, got involved in crime, and was killed in a gang shootout. The others simply vanished into the vastness of America, trying to forget, trying to move on, but forever remaining strangers in this new, peaceful world. Their heroism, their shared pain, their sacrifice turned out to be needed by no one. The war was over, and the country wanted heroes, not cripples with broken souls. Michael O'Connell became one of them, a ghost lost in the crowd. He took off his clerical collar and got a job at the city library. He found solace in the silence and dust of old books. He lived alone, never getting close to anyone. He never spoke about the war. His medal lay at the bottom of an old dresser wrapped in a cloth. Sometimes, at night, he dreamed of the tunnel. He relived that battle over and over, felt the cold weight of the rifle in his hands again, saw the faces of the men he killed again. He would wake up in a cold sweat and sit on the edge of his bed for a long time, staring into the darkness. He died in 1983 of a heart attack. Quietly, unnoticed, in his small apartment filled with books. The obituary in the local paper was only a few lines. Michael O'Connell, a veteran of World War II and former library employee, has passed away. Not a word about him being a priest. Not a word about him being a hero. His story, like the stories of thousands of others, was buried alive under the thick layer of peacetime. Only a few people attended his funeral. But, as the cemetery workers later recounted, someone left a handful of black volcanic sand on his grave next to the modest stone cross. Who it was, or where they brought it from, no one ever knew. The official history of World War II is a story of great battles, brilliant strategists, and victory parades. In this history, there's a place for valor recorded on a commendation, for heroism cast in the bronze of monuments. In the official history, Michael O'Connell remained the fighting padre of Iwo Jima, recipient of the Silver Star, an example to be emulated. But there is another history, the one not written in textbooks, the one whispered by veterans in hospitals and bars when they think no one is listening. This is the trench truth, the folklore of soldiers, where real events are intertwined with legends and superstitions. And in this unofficial history, in these annals of souls crippled by war, Michael O'Connell was a completely different man. His story became a legend. Among the Marines who had been through the Pacific hell, a story circulated about the silent padre. They said there was a chaplain on Iwo Jima who went into the darkest, most terrifying tunnels of Mount Suribachi and stayed there for a whole night, cut off from his men. No one knew exactly what happened down there, but they said that when he came out the next morning, he was a different person. He had stopped praying. He had almost stopped speaking. And in his eyes, as those who saw him told it, the very darkness of those catacombs was frozen. The legend held that in that tunnel, he had encountered not Japanese soldiers, but something far more ancient and terrible. The very spirit of the island, the primal chaos that the war had only unleashed. And to save his men, he had made a deal with that spirit, trading his faith and his soul. This legend was, of course, a fabrication, an attempt by simple soldiers to explain the unexplainable. How a man whose weapons were love and forgiveness could become a cold and effective warrior. They couldn't believe such a transformation was possible without the intervention of supernatural forces. It was easier for them to believe in demons than to admit that hell is not somewhere underground, but inside every human being. And war merely provides the key to the door. Michael O'Connell's story is not just a chronicle of one battle or one man. It is a parable of what happens to a soul when it is placed in conditions for which it was not designed. His faith was not weak. It was simply out of place in a world where God's laws had been suspended by the laws of war. He came to Iwo Jima to save souls, but to save himself and the bodies of his comrades, he had to sacrifice his own. Was the sacrifice worth it? There is no answer to that question. For the Marines he saved, undoubtedly, yes. For himself, most likely not. He won his small war but lost the ultimate battle, the battle for himself. His tragedy is the tragedy of being forgotten. Not the forgetting of a name, but the forgetting of the true price of victory. We remember the heroes, but we forget what they had to pay for their heroism. We celebrate their strength, but we turn away from their wounds, especially those invisible to the eye. This story is a reminder that the most terrible scars of war are left not on the body, but on the soul, and these scars never heal. They remain as a timeless, silent testament that even when you walk out of hell a victor, you carry a piece of its darkness with you forever.